Today's a beautiful day for many reasons. When I come to campus, my name is Miguel Zavala. Welcome to the second annual Ethnic Studies Summit. And I won't do a formal welcome introduction. That will be done by Trisha Gallagher-Gerston. But what I want to do is what we did yesterday. Those of you who were here, so this is day 2, and it's day 2 of a process that doesn't end today. Sometimes people, they reflect on events. What is it that's possible when people come together? One of the things we notice, a lot of dialogue, people excited. Myself, somebody who's doing the organizing together with a bigger team, we're in the backstage, and I felt like I was in my wedding where I'm not enjoying my wedding. But as long as our guests, I got to be careful how I phrase that. My wife's not here. She was here yesterday. But as long as our guests are enjoying, and the little bumps in the road, they don't really change the ethic and the work that's put in it. So what I want to do is the same thing we did yesterday, is begin with the In Lakesh as a way of coming together. So this is a beautiful philosophy, indigenous philosophy, that really encapsulates the essence of being, of our connectedness to each other. And it's become diffused in a lot of ethnic studies courses. Many of you already engage in this process, a ritual beginning your educational spaces with Lain Laklesh. Some of you try to embody these principles in the praxis of education in whatever spaces you are a part of. So let's do this together. We're going to start. In Lakesh, tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. Si te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, me hago daño a mí mismo. Sorry. Si te amo y respeto, if I love and respect you, me amo y respeto yo. I love and respect myself.
Buenos días. Bienvenidos. Good morning. Welcome to the second day of our very beautiful Ethnic Studies Summit. The first thing that I want to do is recognize that this is not my people's land. This is occupied land, stolen land. This is land that has been stolen many times over. Whose land is this? Whose land is it? I was educated in California schools in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s. And I was not offered, and I did not choose any sort of ethnic studies content. I was oblivious of my privilege and power as a white person. I believed in a meritocracy, that if you worked hard enough, you would find success. And if you didn't have success, you hadn't worked hard. In preparing to make remarks this morning and welcome you about my positionality as a white woman in relation to ethnic studies, I landed on this question. What happens if white students don't take ethnic studies? I don't want my 3 young white European children to think that they have earned their current and future place in society. I want them to know the real histories of how they have come to live in a comfortable home, almost assured of a college diploma, a career of their choice, and a healthy, happy, and long life. I am ashamed to admit how easy their lives will be and are compared to their age mates living in poverty, speaking a language other than English, or with another ethnic background. Without their understanding of how they and their European American ancestors benefited from slavery, the right to and access to vote, segregation of institutions, towns, and schools, higher wages, racism, testing bias, and the outlawing of languages other than English in California schools, to name a very few, how will they be able to be part of the solution instead of remaining an ignorant part of the problem? It's been 50 years of fighting for ethnic studies, and we are at this pivotal moment where we are struggling to share and create beautiful ethnic studies, pedagogy, and curriculum for kindergarten through 12th grade schools. That is what today is about. Today is about nurturing ethnic studies. I am a mother. I know about nurturing. Carry your mother with you today as you nurture your exploration of curriculum and pedagogy. But dialogue, question, be critical. Enjoy sharing in the sessions today. All right. With that said, I would like to invite Sean Arce to come up and do an opening ceremony. Sean Arce is a former Mexican-American studies teacher, and he is the coordinator of Chicano Studies at Azusa Unified School District.
So, part of the happening of making today the event that it is we have the first ethnic studies class at Chapman, and Dr. Suhu was strategic in opening that space. We made it happen within maybe 2 days of when we had to turn in the curriculum. It's beautiful to do that. I frame that as, I got my foot in that door, and so it's not going to close completely anymore. And it's been an honor working with 5 students. It's a small class. It could have been canceled, but I said, no, let's not cancel it. Let's do it as a reading and conference course. And so the students are the ones who are going to be active today. We're going to move towards a critical reflection on race after Dr. Christine Sleeter's talk. But I do want us to thank the lead students who had made this event possible. And Carly Waterbury is one of the students who will now introduce Christine Sleeter. This is Carly.
Thank you. So it is with a great, sincere honor that I get to introduce Dr. Sleeter today. She's a founding member of Cal State University, Monterey. She's a speaker, she's an activist, a teacher, and an author. She has spoken all the way from New Zealand to Chile, and she was the 2012 Chapman University Paulo Freire Education Project Social Justice Award recipient. But I know a different side of Dr. Sleeter. I had the honor of interviewing her in the fall, and she helped me with my research. And not only did she help me with my research, but she interviewed me back. And by doing that, she showed me that I had a voice in this world of ethnic studies, and I had a place here. And she gave me a self-confidence I would not have had without her. And for that reason, it's an honor to introduce and welcome Dr. Christine Sleeter.
Buenos dias. Get the water going here. Oh, somehow I need to get out of this PowerPoint and into my own. While Miguel is helping with the PowerPoint, I'd like to thank Chapman University and the California State chapter of the National Association for Multicultural Education for collaborating on putting together this really wonderful conference and inviting me to be one of the participant keynote speakers at this conference. I'm going to address ethnic studies and white teachers because I think white teachers actually do need to be a part of ethnic studies. And like Trish, I think somehow white people need to be engaged with ethnic studies, but to do so in a way in which white people aren't then reframing it and taking over, which is what we have a tendency to do. So I would like to start by saying a little bit about my own learning as what kind of things got me into this, and then move to some implications for pedagogy involving white teachers. But before I do that, I want to contrast 2 very different perspectives in thinking about the U.S. society, who we are, and what we should be doing. From a dominant perspective, which is what I grew up with, when you think about how society works, you learn that you sort of grow up being told that we live in a society that's fair and open to everybody. And this is kind of what Trish was saying earlier. And this was certainly a message I grew up with both at home as well as at school, and didn't think any differently about it for quite a long time. Then when you look around and you see that some groups of people seem to be doing better than others, how do you understand the disparities? Well, there are plenty of social stereotypes out there that you can grab onto that focus on deficit theorizing. And so then you start understanding the stratification in society by what you presume to be characteristics of groups. Well, then what would be solutions? And this is what I see people do quite a bit as it relates to multicultural education. Remediate, have some celebrations of diversity, and try to be colorblind. An ethnic studies perspective demands a major shift in understanding. How do you understand the nature of society? You understand it in terms of how it's been historically rigged for those in power. Then the nature of so-called have-not groups can be understood in terms of strengths, resources, with the community and families being sources of wisdom and long-standing struggles for trying to bring about social change. How do you understand the nature of solutions? Remove barriers that those who have experienced them identify. Very, very different set of strategies as well as understandings. So a question begins that I've been grappling with is, how do you take people who look like me, who grew up from the dominant perspective, and that's what they've been taught pretty much all their lives, and get them to shift toward a perspective that's more consistent with ethnic studies and with struggles in communities of color. So let me tell you a little bit of my own story. I grew up in Southern Oregon, in a small town at the time, Medford, Oregon. It was a predominantly white town, and didn't have any substantive contact with people of color in the US until I was probably in my 20s. I spent a summer living in Japan, which actually helped, but it doesn't exactly translate real well. I signed up to learn how to teach in urban schools on an urban education program that was based in the urban area of Seattle. And so this is a picture of the first class that I was working with. It was an 8-month program, community-based. We were supposed to live in the community of the school we were teaching at, and it was in a working class school, this particular school in which there was no racial ethnic majority. And I looked at my students, and they came from a very different space than where I came from. They looked different. And so I immediately got on to what became a lifelong learning curve. One of the things that I did was I realized that my education, even though I thought of it as a very good education, was a very white education. It was very limited in that regard. So I began reading ethnic studies books, and I actually never stopped. Initially, my selections, I had some very good selections, some not so good selections. And since the narrative in the books didn't exactly fit with the narrative I had grown up with, in fact, it was challenging that narrative, it took a while before things started to stick. But I kept reading because the reading actually was beginning to help me understand where I was and the folks that I was working with. I also began to position myself as a learner in relationship to my students. And I was getting certified in secondary social studies, and this was a world history class that I'd been placed in. The way that the social studies teachers taught in the school I was in was my cooperating teacher would give a lecture, and then students would have a chapter to read, and then they would write answers at the end of the chapter. And as a student teacher, my role was to go around and help the students write answers to the questions. So I began to realize that the students were incredibly bored, and that in answering the questions, rather than thinking about something, they would go back into the chapter, find a sentence to copy it down, and go on to the next question. And that seemed to be okay as far as the teacher was concerned. But I wanted to get to know the students, so I spent time with them outside of class, just talking to them about their lives and what they were interested in and whatever they wanted to talk about. For about a month, I supervised boys basketball in the gym during lunch hour because no other adult would do that. And I know zero about basketball. But through building these relationships and getting to know the students, that actually became very pivotal when it came time for me to take over the class. So the day I was in charge of the class for the first time, we had gotten up to feudalism in Europe. And so that's what I was going to teach. And so I had worked to prepare this lecture on feudalism in Europe. I started my lecture. Things seemed to be going okay, so my cooperating teacher left. And I kept going. About a minute later, I was looking at my students going, they look so bored. And it was like, if this is what teaching is, I'm not doing this. So I put the lecture notes aside. And I knew the students by then. And so I said, what are you guys interested in? This is social studies. What do you want to learn about? And I don't know that a teacher had ever asked them that before. And so they threw out a bunch of different topics. And what they landed on that they really wanted to know about was women's liberation. Because the women's movement was very visible out in the streets, and they had a lot of questions. So I'm like, okay, women's liberation, what would you like to know about it? So we generated questions. I wrote them on the board, and I'm thinking, where am I going with this? And then well, how would we go about learning about these things? So we generated some learning strategies. And by the time my cooperating teacher returned, I basically, with the students, mapped out a way of studying women's liberation. He let me go with that for the rest of the week, and the students, and then we went back to feudalism in Europe. And what I saw was the students becoming very engaged when what was being taught was co-constructed with them, and when their questions were a part of the curriculum. When we went back to feudalism in Europe, and at the time, I didn't know how to put together where students were coming from with the academic material. So it was gradually, for a while, with nobody helping me do that I started trying to figure out how to do that. But getting to know the students by positioning myself as a learner rather than as a teacher became critically important. And the third piece that became critically important was living in the community. We were supposed to as a part of this program, but when the program ended, I wanted to stay teaching in inner city Seattle, so I stayed living in inner city Seattle for the next several years. And my friends during that time were a combination of white and African American, mostly educators, but there was also some folks in other fields. And in the context of being in that environment with the folks that I was with, I underwent a major re-education, and I changed. And I think it's those three things that for me became critically important of the ethnic studies reading, the engagement with students, and the engagement with communities. Now I'd like to bring this up to the present of what do we know about ethnic studies pedagogy. You may be aware of an article that I did with some other folks here. It's under Alison Tintianco-Cabales, who talked yesterday, was the lead author on it, where we looked at what ethnic studies pedagogy is, and part of what we did was look at the research on ethnic studies teachers and what successful and unsuccessful ethnic studies teachers do in their classrooms. And we came out with some ideas that actually it turned out to be very similar to the learning process that I was bumbling through over a period of years on my own. Ethnic studies teachers have a purpose, a sense of purpose about ethnic studies. And the purpose is to challenge racism and to decolonize, to challenge colonial relations and how that have been imprinted on the way people think and see themselves. And there are other things that can go along with it, but if it's not directly about challenging racism, then it's not really ethnic studies. Ethnic studies teachers deepen their own ethnic studies content knowledge, not just by reading one or two books, but it's an ongoing learning process because all of us have gone through a Eurocentric hegemonic education. And it's both unlearning that education as well as learning the multiple stories that are a part of who we are. And it not only suppressed knowledge that had been out there for a while, but the ongoing knowledge that continues to be produced. So it is an ongoing learning process that ethnic studies teachers are engaged in. Ethnic studies teachers use culturally responsive and relationship-based pedagogy with their students in the classroom all the time, in which they're teaching to high academic expectations in ways that build on what students bring. Ethnic studies engage with the community on an ongoing basis, and they reflect deeply about their own cultural identity. And it's this last point with respect to white teachers that I want to take a look at, because a lot of us who are white aren't really sure where to go with reflecting on who we are as white. In fact, this is an issue that's come up quite a bit in the research. These are quotes from different scholars who have talked about how you ask white people of who are you culturally, and well, I don't have a culture. Or I'm like nobody, I'm white bread, which I picked that up and gave it as the title for my first novel, White Bread. Or in 2016, the struggle for white identity is not just a political problem, it's about the deep story of feeling stuck while others move forward. A part of the issue here has to do with a complete lack of understanding of the past and how we're situated within that past. And this is an example of a quote that a number of years ago a white teacher said to me as part of a study that I was doing. She was teaching in a school in which a large number of her students were African American, and she would periodically complain about the parents. And she would do so in relationship to what she understood history to be as refracted through her own Italian American experience. And then we didn't have the free lunches, so like sort of why do they expect free handouts? And what this was reflected to me is a lack of understanding of racism currently, and also a lack of understanding of, in some ways, her own Italian American ancestry. She had grabbed onto a national narrative of pulling ourselves up by their bootstraps, and then just was sort of applying that as if, this goes back to as if we live in a free and open society, and if you just work hard enough, you'll make it. I love these quotations. Adrienne Rich says, in America, we have only the present tense. We don't know history. And yet, as William Faulkner points out, the past is never dead. It's not even past. So whether we know history or not, history is with us, and history continues to shape who we are and what's happening. And writers of color have been urging us to please pay attention to the histories that we tend to forget, and particularly those of us who are white. Toni Morrison was talking about how we live in a land, I'll just read this, we live in a land where the past is always erased. And America is the innocent future in which immigrants can come and start over, where the slate is clean. The past is absent, or it's romanticized. This culture doesn't encourage dwelling on, let alone to coming to terms with the truth about that past. And that memory is much more in danger now than it was 30 years ago. Or Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his book, Between the World and Me, talks about the forgetting and what it is that, where he talks about the dream that white people have about how they think this place runs, about all of the forgetting of violence and racism that are a part of our past. And he makes this interesting observation that the new people were something else before they were white, and challenges those of us who are white to try to uncover what it is that we are besides white. So it's in relationship to these kinds of observations that one of the tools, not the only tool, but one of the tools that I've been working on as a way of trying to help anybody, since I draw a lot on my own life experience with this, grapple with these questions in relationship to themselves, is a process that I call critical family history, which is taking your family history but then locating that history within wider contexts of struggles over power and race and economic resources. Most people, when they do family history, just do their own, who the ancestors were, and they don't do that larger contextualization, and it's particularly white people who don't do it. So I've been writing and doing workshops and stuff about critical family history, and I'll just give you an example of what kinds of insights it can illuminate. But first, a little bit about the research process. There's the genealogy research process, which is what family historians normally do. But then there's this also social contextual research process. And there are various ways of going about that. The way that I've used most and have found quite useful has been when I'm doing the research, and I develop these columns on a spreadsheet, the main question I'm asking is who else was around when I'm looking at a family unit at a particular place and in a particular time, and what were the relationships among sociocultural groups at that place and time. So let me take an example from my own family history. I have a great-great-grandmother, who's also, her name is Christine. I wasn't named after her. What I learned growing up is that she came from Switzerland. She was a dressmaker and a milliner, made hats. and that she was an astrologer and a medium. And we had heard, a story we heard when I was growing up is that she was a fortune teller in New Orleans, which she wasn't. But we were like, ooh, fortune teller in New Orleans in the family, that's really cool. So when I started doing this research, first I had to find the spelling of her name because it was, we weren't even quite sure what the last name was. But I finally tracked it down. And in the process of doing the research, my older sister, put her name in Google and came up with this article from the Sacramento Bee in 1882. And I've highlighted the parts that are pertinent to her. At the bottom, I took her full name out and just used her initials that's in red. But the Women's Protective League of California, just the part that's highlighted, the objects of the society are to discourage the employment of Chinese in any capacity, whatever, by the people of this state. Oh my God, great-great-grandmother Christine was an anti-Chinese activist. Ugh, what do I do with that? My older sister was like, wow, she was really prejudiced. But I thought there's a bigger story going on here, besides the fact maybe she was really prejudiced. But I want to unpack what the larger story is. So when I started, I went back into various databases and found she was born in Switzerland in 1832, arrived in New Orleans, which is where we got the idea that she was a fortune teller in New Orleans, and then went up to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where she was a dressmaker, and her husband, who I have far less information about, worked in the cotton mills. We had a story that one of my cousins told us, that when General Grant came into Vicksburg during the Civil War, they were burning houses of people who would take down the flag of the North and raise the flag of the South. No, they would burn houses of people who would take down the flag of the South and put up the flag of the North. And that she refused to do that. She said, General Grant, I was born, I live in the South, and I don't live in the North, so I'm not going to put your flag up, and he burned the house down. That's kind of what the story was. But there was things about the context that actually became very important to this story. Vicksburg, Mississippi, right before the Civil War. In the census, there were 4 things that you could get categorized as. And when immigrants would come into the country, it was important what you got categorized as. The census categories in existence then were white, free black, free other, and slave. In Vicksburg, about 1/3 of the population were enslaved, and most working in the fields in cotton. And at the time, there had been a lot of slaves working in the mills who were sent back out into the fields as the cotton industry was expanding. And the mill owners were recruiting from Europe, which is probably why my ancestors came in the first place. Now, I found this passport description of her, and you look at it, brown eyes, black hair, low forehead, blah, 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 and a dark complexion. And I thought, if she's coming into this context, she would want to be classified as white. But you would look at her and maybe not be real sure, could she be free other? And it mattered how you were classified because the rights you had went along with the classification. So probably from the get-go, she learned to fight to be recognized as white because she was a business person. And she would want the full range of access to property and access to work that she could get. The Civil War came. The family story was, there is documentation that stuff like that happened. But in reading also an old digitized book about the Vicksburg siege, if she was identifying with the South, then that was a very, very, very difficult time. So she probably did take up a very active white Southern identity, which bears itself out in 1864 when her 4th child was born, and she named him after the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. So already I'm seeing a European immigrant taking up whiteness in a particular context. So the Civil War ends. She tries to make use of the new bankruptcy laws because her dressmaking business was kind of falling apart. And by 1880, she and the family had moved to San Francisco, where in 1880 she had a Chinese servant, but by 1882 she had become an anti-Chinese activist. So I wondered what it was about San Francisco that provoked her to take the learning to be white that she had learned in Vicksburg and enact that in a very public way in San Francisco. So I looked at the demographics of San Francisco, and what I discovered was that following the Civil War, both a lot of white people from the South moved west, as well as the railroads had been completed, and a lot of Chinese workers were now out of work and came to San Francisco also looking for work. And there was way too little employment for the people who were looking for work. At the time, there were these stories circulating about young working class girls going into prostitution because they couldn't find work. So things like the Women's Protective League were founded to protect jobs for white girls and to keep people of color from getting those same jobs. So this is a part of my legacy. And it's a part that I, as a white person, need to recognize that I have inherited. I don't come to this work with a legacy of innocence. I come with a legacy of people who have done a variety of, this is just one of many stories I've uncovered, but people who have come certainly benefiting from racism, but also, as this example showed, learning how to take on whiteness in order to become an active racist herself. So where do I go with this? Well, there are actually other stories at the same time. And we do need to know our own stories, but it's also important, I think, to also become and own our own stories, but also to become aware that there are other narratives that white people have to draw on as well. For example, this was during the legacy of the racism against Chinese Americans, where there's a whole laundry list here of both in San Francisco, as well as in California, as well as at the US level, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act at the same time. But there are legacies also of white people working against racism, and I chose to highlight here white women working against racism. And it's also important for us to learn about these folks, because at the same time my great-great-grandmother was taking up arms against Chinese people, there were also white people, not a lot of them, but there were white people, including white women, who were working against racism. And one who I found particularly interesting myself is Mary White Ovington, who's at the corner over on this side, because she was one of the co-founders of the NAACP in 1909. I've been a Golden Heritage Life member of the NAACP for a number of years. And when I found out that the NAACP was co-founded by a white woman, I was like, wow, I want to know more about her. That's kind of a woman after my own heart. And she was a suffragist. She comes from a politically active family who was always active in issues around social justice. So that's partly where she got her social justice activism. But while a lot of the white suffragists were fighting for the rights of mainly white women, she early on became very much engaged in struggles against racism, struggles for civil rights. In 1890, right around the time when my great-great-grandmother was working to exclude Chinese people, Mary White Ovington had heard a talk by W.E.B. Du Bois and became very inspired what he had to say and started asking the question of what can I do to help? So it's from these kinds of people that we can also draw legacies of stories and legacies of possibilities. So I think for all of us, including white people in ethnic studies, we're at a point now of being able to rewrite history and try to rewrite history in a way that includes all of us. But for those of us who are white and who have been positioned as the dominant group in power, that requires us to do some fundamental changes in how we understand ourselves, how we understand the nature of society, and how we understand ourselves in relationship to this work. So I think that there's work to be done, but hopefully we can help kind of navigate and show what that might look like. Earlier, Trish was asking me if I've written much about white people in ethnic studies, and I'm like, well, yeah, a little bit, and I guess we need to start kind of, more actively writing that and working on that. So thank you.
So thank you, Christine. Always pushing us to think about race and how it operates. And what I appreciate is the level of reflexivity in thinking this through. In my engagement with a lot of folks, it's very challenging for us to think about how we're complicit and how that is also layered and complicated, even amongst people of color. When my daughter was born, my mom, her very first question, and we're Chicanos, her very first question, ¿Tiene ojos de color? Does she have colored eyes? And for those of you who understand the question and its nuances, by colored eyes, ojos de color, she meant azules, verduzcos, green or blue, as if brown and black do not exist as colored eyes. And it's in my own family. So I think these layers are important. Thinking through how our families and our stories and excavating those, we can understand how power operates. What we want to do now for about 30 minutes is engage in a collective reflection on race. This is by design, something we thought about. Instead of us kind of going, typically, right, we have a keynote. I'm going to say something that's going to pump you up, hopefully. Wake myself up because I slept at 2 a.m. But instead of doing that sort of keynote, then we're going to jump into sessions and learn, we can do that. But I think collectively it's important for us to enter a certain space of learning and reflection, and we're going to do that now. And let's see where that takes us. But there are 3 pieces to this. One is this idea of the adaptive unconscious. Then we're going to have some spoken word. This is also what we're organizing, the ethnic studies class that I've been teaching and learning with students. And then we're going to have some meditation that I think is important to bring that into our lives. And in thinking about the meditation piece, as we were brainstorming with students, I was also thinking of my son, who's 3.5 years old, Santi. And Santi, he is in a Korean daycare. And he is learning yoga, and he meditates. And we ask him, Santi, meditate. He sits down, but he's 3.5, so he goes, and he moves his whole body. It's very bodily. And so I think it's important for us to segue in that way, right? So that's how we're going to move. So what I'm going to ask you is simple. We'll start with the letter A. And as I call the letter, I want you to just shout out, what is that letter? What does it represent? So A, anybody, just shout it out. All. Who said all? All. Hey, Shannon, Wayne, I think you know these. So all. Letter B, shout it out. Thank you. They represent brands, so I'm giving you a framing for this. You've seen these. Bubblicious. How about the C? Campbell's. D. Dawn. Okay, Eggo. F. Fritos. It's a little harder. Hebrew National. I heard Hebrew National. What is this one? Icy. Jello. Kool-Aid. Lysol. M&M. Nilla. Yeah. Q-tips. Reese's Pieces. Tide. Tide. What's this? Uncle Ben's. Yes. How about this one? V8. It's what's funny about V8 is that it's like a whole bunch of sugar and it doesn't really have the things it's supposed to have. Oh, sorry. How about this one? W. Whisk. X. This one's harder. Anybody? Extra. Y. York. And zest. So the question to you is, at some point as I was going through these, and that wasn't my intention actually, it was to go slower, but at some point you were like just in rhythm, just saying what these were. And the question I want us to think about is, where and how did you know that? Or another way of framing it is, did you take the time in a class called Brands 101 where you deliberately studied this? I hope you didn't. And part of this exercise is to begin the conversation about how race also operates. I'm not going to deconstruct these specific brands. Last night, we had a beautiful conversation with Shauna Bajan, Ethnic Studies Now Coalition. They're pushing back on Dr. Zeus. Some of you are probably aware the history of Dr. Zeus, but also the time period in which he was perpetuating white supremacy. Was a cartoonist that was depicting African Americans in a very problematic way, and also the Asian American community. And so they're going to pressure the NEA to like remove this campaign for Dr. Zeus, or at least historicize. I'm not going to deconstruct each one of these, but I want you to think about how these encodings are manifest, and how, in what ways does race also operate on this level. How we may deliberately learn about race through our lived experience, our interaction, but also how some of this is happening before our very eyes. And how do we get to the point, like my mother, when my daughter is born, who asked the very first question, ¿Tiene ojos de color? Does she have colored eyes? How does that happen? So with that, I'm going to leave you with that question, and we're going to transition into spoken word by lead students Annabelle and Shannon. Let's give them a round of applause for coming up.
I'm not Annabelle, she'll be here later.
And now also another ethnic studies student, Farah Sue, she's going to lead us through the meditation.
Hello. Let's just give another round of applause for a wonderful spoken word artist. Sweet. So I'm going to lead us in a kind of self-reflection slash meditation session. The way that it's going to work is that I'm going to ask us to close our eyes, and then we're going to take 3 collective breaths together, and then I will be asking 10 reflexive questions, and then we will finish the activity by taking 3 collective breaths again. So I kind of want to just preface this activity by just tying up what we heard from our keynote speaker, Dr. Sleeter, and Dr. Zavala, and our spoken word artist today, that we just want this session to be a critical reflection on our positionality as well as how we hold our space and how that would affect others. So yesterday was filled with a lot of wonderful and inspiring panelists, so I just wanted us to take that experience and what we've learned from yesterday and reflect on that so we can carry it on for today. So if I may ask for everyone to please close their eyes. And I will lead us in 3 collective breaths, and I'll count to 5 each, okay? So breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4, 5. One more time, breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4, 5. Last one, breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4, 5. Please keep your eyes closed for this whole activity, actually, yeah. So I want you to think critically and answer honestly. This is an internal self-meditation activity, so challenge yourself to think about these questions. And don't worry, because no one's going to hear you. So let's begin. I want you to start off by thinking about your ethnic or racial background. What identities do you have as a person? Race, ethnicity, national, religion, gender identity, expression, political affiliation, socioeconomic status, sexual identity, ability, or age. Now take those thoughts and think about, what does it mean to belong to these groups? What does it mean to be of the person of race? What does it mean to be the person of your socioeconomic status? What does it mean to belong to these groups that you identify with? Now, I want you to think about, what role does your race play within your sense of self? How often do you think about your race? What specific ways have you gained or lost benefits due to your racial identity? But also, what have you gained or lost due to the other identities that you may hold? Now I want you to think about, who do you interact with socially, professionally, and spiritually? Do these people match the same identities that you hold? Or do you find yourself in groups that you don't necessarily identify with? Now think about, what do you know about how to relate to and interpret the behavior of others who occupy these social locations that may be similar or different than your own? How do you treat these people in your daily lives? How do you treat your friends, your coworkers, your family, or even just strangers that you pass by? Now, think about if you've ever experienced a sense of power or lack of power in relation to your racial or gender identity, or class, or sexual orientation, or professional identity. What kind of foods do you think of when you think of home? What kind of food do you consider strange or exotic? What are some things that your family members told you about the color of your skin? What are often comments that you hear about people that also share the color of your skin? Now, I want you to think about, what do you do on a day-to-day basis that might contribute to inequality? What have you learned about how to interpret the behavior of people whose race, ethnicity, gender, ability, or religion is different than your own? What if you add class to that equation? What if you add sexual orientation to that equation? Think about your conscious intentions when you interact with people who may not share the same identities as you do. What are your intentions when you interact with a person who is Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian American, biracial or multiracial, European American, refugees or immigrants, people who are queer, or people with disabilities? Now think about, why may the consequences or outcomes of your actions not fit or match with these intentions? Why may your interaction with these people be taken differently than what you want? Okay, now I want you to center your thoughts again and kind of finish up what you were thinking. I also want you to take that time to take this time to just think about an overview of your own thoughts, and maybe even ask yourself, where did you learn these ideas? Who taught these to you? And what are you doing to challenge them? Okay, we're gonna take 3 collective exit breaths together again. So I'm gonna count. So breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now you can slowly open your eyes. And I just want to say thank you for your time, and I hope you take those reflections and apply them to the rest of the day.
Thank you, Farah, for leading us through that. I needed the oxygen. I realized I feel calm. So before we head out into the spaces of the workshops, I want to talk about the schedule. And prior to that is just go over common myths about ethnic studies, because this summit is about ethnic studies. And yesterday, the sessions tackled the theme of activist women of color and what that means. But today, it's on nurturing ethnic studies in classrooms and communities, blurring the two spaces. This is coming out of a publication that California Name has put together, and it is something that comes from our experience with educators, counselors, principals, even teacher educators, historians. And these are statements that have been made of ethnic studies, but I think it's important to kind of walk through the myths. One of the things we've heard is we already do ethnic studies. We have culturally responsive teaching. It's something we've heard from some teachers who tend to push back, perhaps not understanding what ethnic studies means. And so thinking of ethnic studies as culturally relevant, there's intersections in the pedagogy, in the curriculum, the way it's shaped, but it's not necessarily the same thing. Another statement, ethnic studies is simply a version of social studies and or history. The simply is emphasized because it tends to minimize the possibilities of ethnic studies as a field in and of itself. It is simply social studies history. So if you're a social studies history teacher, I could see why you would resist ethnic studies coming into your classrooms, into the spaces of the school. It's just history. What I've learned with some of the teachers in Santa Ana, I'm also in the Santa Ana task force, is, well, it's not just history, it's actually a more accurate history if we want to play that game. Ethnic studies is only focused on race, the emphasis on only. Not necessarily. From its very genesis, intersectionality was a key component. How race is conceptualized needs to be unpacked. Is it just discursive? Is it the social spaces and the arrangement? Is it historical ways in which race is manifest? Is it tied to things like colonialism? How is colonialism tied to capitalism? I think that intersectionality has been at the root of ethnic studies, But what I would say from my lens, if it doesn't critically interrogate and have race as something of an object of study and that's integral to it, it's not ethnic studies. Ethnic studies teaches students to hate whites. This is what we heard in Tucson, right? Worse, it teaches them to hate other similar groups of people. So I've heard this as well. You're teaching Chicano studies, that means you're teaching Mexicanos to hate Centroamericanos because you're not dealing with Centroamericanos. You're marginalizing Guatemaltecos in the context of teaching Chicano studies. And I think this lens is an easy one to appropriate when one is an outsider, when one is opposed to things like ethnic studies. What was interesting about the MAS program, when you look at Precious Knowledge, how many people have seen Precious Knowledge? Okay, good. And if you haven't, I highly recommend you see that film. It's a beautiful film that tells the story of the struggle in Tucson. And one of the things that's interesting when that program was critiqued, it was mostly by people who had never stepped into the classroom. And this is not unfamiliar to us. You know, reformers who are not in schools, who are not teachers, who are not the counselors, who are not the parents. And there are people up in Sacramento or in DC or their corporate entities making decisions on what is to be taught and how it's to be taught. But what was interesting is when you interviewed, through the film, when you talked with the teachers and the students, it was actually a pedagogy of love, as one of the educators said. It was not anything related to hate. It's a myth. It's a construction of what ethnic studies supposedly is, but it's not about that. Another one, ethnic studies is a remediation program for at-risk youth. That it's just about increasing test scores. Part of this might come through the narrative that may be indirect from folks who do amazing work, statistical analyses that are out there. D.N. Penner's work in schools in San Francisco, Nolan Cabrera and his work in the schools in Tucson. Amazing statistical analysis that basically shows ethnic studies does make a difference if you're looking at standard measures of achievement. But I think we can misread that literature in saying that it's just a program that increases that. It's more than that. Ethnic studies, from my lens, it's a spiritual, cultural, reclaiming of identity, but it involves also critical analysis of ourselves in relationship to social structures. It is more than that. And also the term at risk is very problematic. We need to problematize what that means. If adopted as a graduation requirement, students may not want ethnic studies. I've heard this in at least 3 districts, and I will not call them out. My whole thing is like, how do you know? and there's often this statement comes with, there's no more money. I think, and I had this conversation with people yesterday, it's a complete misrepresentation to say there's no more money. Money is allocated. So we can say something different, like money has already been allocated. We're not gonna do driver's ed 2.0, and it's money is there. It's just what is it allocated on, but we don't consult with the students. We don't talk with them, and if we did, especially those who are in the pilot programs where ethnic studies is not quite yet institutionalized as a graduation requirement, let's talk with them and talk about their experiences and what that means. I know in the context of the class that I teach, and some of my students are here, I teach a social justice approach to social studies. And these students, they've been attending Mr. McAllis's ethnic studies class. And they themselves have come as observers, but I love Paulo because he says, you're not coming to observe, you're gonna be a participant in this space. And his students actually were presenting their YPAR projects yesterday. And they themselves, what I see is they're coming transformed. And sometimes by being in that space for a couple of hours, getting excited of how do I reinvent this kind of pedagogy in the context of like elementary students, because most of the students in my class, they're headed towards elementary. Ethnic studies courses are successful because of teacher efficacy rather than the curriculum. So I heard this at a party, a teacher in a district not far from here, and his argument's a dicey one. It's actually not easy to answer this one. What he was saying is, yes, the data might show that students who take ethnic studies courses, that they do well. But he was saying, but how do you control for the fact that maybe it's those teachers that are phenomenal? So it doesn't really matter the content and all that. But if we look at the research, prior to those studies that have looked at like the impact on district level, work like the work Christine Sleeter has done and others, the curriculum does matter. When you see yourself in the textbooks, it does matter. I know that's the experience I've had personally. I never saw myself in textbooks. And when I did, it was a representation. Like, we're going to talk about Latinos. Let's look at, like, huge PowerPoint on gangs. I remember our history teacher kind of getting upset because we weren't doing the work, and the way he taught it was very kind of the questions. I don't know if any of you went through that schooling, or probably a lot of you did, where there's questions in the back of the chapter that you're supposed to read for that week. And somebody like my brother, he's so good at it, like by a day and a half, he's done. You go back, you answer all the questions, you turn in your assignment, it's free time for 3.5 days. And I remember this teacher stating very matter-of-factly, like, you are going to be picking up my trash. You are going to end up as a custodian, etc. These stories have stuck with me because I think that the curriculum, it was Eurocentric. It was what is normative, but it did not represent my experience. It did not represent my family, my parents in a positive way. Here's another one. Ethnic studies is most effective at the high school and college level. So there's that narrative. It only works because these students are ready for it. Today, in a beautiful way, we have people breaking down pedagogy at the elementary level and how we can get little children to critically analyze their worlds, looking at gender, race, class. It can be done. And I think I may have shared the story yesterday. My son, who's 3.5, so I had an accident a year ago, broken clavicle, 2 ribs, and then I finished the semester, and then it was more in the winter, I took a week off as a professor, which for a professor is a long time. And at least for me. And so I took the week off and spent that week watching the Avatar, the cartoon, with my kids. And towards the very end, how many people are familiar with the Avatar? Towards the very end, there's this build-up. There's a week of episodes that are kind of boring, but I was just, but there's a build-up, and Aang, he's like the protagonist. He's going through a lot of inner struggles. And part of that is because he's destined to face Fire Lord Ozai. And Fire Lord Ozai is like the master fire. And there's a comet, Zozin's comet, that's coming. And he's going to leverage that extra energy to defeat all the other nations. They had already defeated the air nation. And it's why the last airbender was there, and that was Aang. And so Aang is destined, but Aang was also taught that he could not commit violence towards others. He was trained by monks. And so that was a big dilemma as a 12-year-old, a cartoon character, right, going through that. Like, what do? I cannot commit violence. How do I defeat? And so there's a moment towards the end where Aang, what he does is he learned this from a turtle. It's beautiful metaphors. I recommend, looking at this. A green turtle in the ocean appears and teaches him how to use energy and how to change that. And so Aang, what he does, there's a beautiful scene where they come together and you see the forces of like good and evil, all these tropes. And instead of fighting, what he does is he touches him on the forehead and takes that energy and almost dies in the process. But then his energy overcomes Fire Lord Ozai. Fire Lord Ozai loses his firebending power. And he becomes, from my way of seeing that cartoon, he becomes more human, but doesn't know what to do. So what's interesting, I relate this to my son because when the current president, I will not name, wins, my daughter did have an anxiety attack. My son had a different reaction. There was a little conversation we had, and then he, at some point, tells me, Papi is, and I won't say the name, DT, Fire Lord Ozai? He's like Fire Lord Ozai, isn't he? And I said, Santi, like how? Well, he wants to take power, and does he like fire? Like, does he like burning people? I relate this story, and I won't go into, like, I love that space he opened because then I was trying to teach him, but then I was getting I was deconstructing things, and then I lost them. But as a 3.5-year-old, he was able to critically read his world and draw connections to things of what's happening. And so it is a myth to say ethnic studies is only for high school kids. And some Raza teachers have told me, like, it's also sometimes too late when we're thinking of ethnic studies at the level already at high school. But the little children, think of the history, the deculturization. Um, and I'm losing power here. So the other is college professors of ethnic studies are most qualified to teach ethnic studies courses. Some teachers have faced that, and the struggle is that academics like myself are the experts. That's completely false. I know the struggles, a lot of the histories of ethnic studies happen at the college level. It was student-led, demanding ethnic studies. But to say that professors or the ethnic studies is the domain of people in universities is very problematic. Another mythology, ethnic studies classes might engage students, but I don't see how they address real learning. It's a hurtful statement for those who do ethnic studies pedagogy. It's the idea that they just show they do hip hop, spoken word, and they show like films. And that's what they do in ethnic studies class. It's complete mythology. If you look at El Rancho Unified, the way in which ethnic studies there is manifest, it's interdisciplinary. It's in history, yes. It's in the sciences. It's in arts. They do literacy in the context of that work. They do mathematics. So to say ethnic studies is not real learning, it's just a loaded statement. So I will leave you thinking about these mythologies. What is for today? Here's the schedule. So session 1, 11:15. We're going to end a little bit early here. Give us a space. There's going to be coffee. It's going to go for an hour and 15 minutes, session 1. Then we have lunch. That's at the piazza, so everything is north of here. Session 2, it's going to be an hour and 15. Gives us a little bit of time to dialogue. And please don't forget, we have our closing keynote. It's going to be here in Memorial Hall. And it's going to be Dr. Melina Abdullah. If you have not heard Dr. Melina Abdullah, you've missed out. Please make it. She speaks from a very powerful space. She's the president of the LA chapter of Black Lives Matter, is at Cal State LA, Africana Studies. I've co-taught with her in summer programs, met her through Carlos Tejeda some years back, and when we asked her, it was just awesome saying, absolutely, how do we support ethnic studies here in Orange County of all places, where maybe 10 miles away we had a march in a beach in support of the person I won't name. So we are in a place that's transforming Orange County. People have these narratives, just Disneyland. And I know yesterday that's been a struggle, right? The community challenging those narratives, not just Disneyland. And it's not just white students. It's a very diverse community that's changing. When you think of places like Santana and Anaheim, even the city of Orange, where we're situated in. So just one thing, some canceled sessions. I want you to make a note of this. On page 13, there's a native languages piece. And sorry, the battery just went. But I can read these to you. So there is an addendum as well. It's a little half white sheet that's inside your program. And in that addendum, it's native languages, the fight for the revitalization and expansion of the Hupa language, the people in Northern California. That's been canceled. I was bummed. I was ready to go to that one. That's on page 13. Also on page 15, ethnic studies in the elementary classroom. That one is also canceled. And there is a third one that's not listed on page 12. Dr. Golden, he is very ill, has a fever now. And he was trying to come, and I said, please, just relax, stay at home. And I don't want to catch the bug. So there we have it. We hope that this is a space of learning for all of us, that we engage in dialogue, that we create community, we break bread together at the piazza at lunch, and we're going to end with Dr. Melina Abdullah. So why don't we end with the unity clap? So somebody start us off with the unity clap. So enjoy. And there's coffee, and we have a little, we have the Paulo Freire. Real quick, there's a Paulo Freire statue on campus. Please, it's this way, not that far. If you want to take pictures, we also have Benito Juarez. go here, some beautiful statues on campus. And Martin Luther King.